We've all become used to the last 35 years, where the Chinese entered the system with 1 billion workers, pushing down the cost of manufactured goods, and the collapse of the Soviet system dumped an empire of raw materials on the system at the same time. And so that 30-year period since 1990, when we've had cheaper and cheaper and cheaper manufactured goods and low inflation in commodity prices, this is like the sum total of most of our business experience. This is the most atypical period in human history. It was always going to last for a historical moment, and the historical moment is now ending. We now have to do something a little bit more normal. And in a world where you're going to get a little bit more normal, the two factors you need to look at are demographics and geography. What you're looking at here is just a map of the waterways and the farmlands of the United States. Those blue lines, the greater Mississippi, the intracoastal, all the attached rivers, that is more miles of navigable waterway than the rest of the planet combined. It's about 13,000 miles. We have the lowest cost for internal transport on the planet, and it should be lower because of the Jones Act. We basically told all foreigners that they couldn't participate in our water transport. You guys, I think, can imagine what would happen to trucking and trains and aerospace if we did that. Oh my God, what a shit show that would be. But we've done it for water, so we've taken our single biggest geographic advantage and and now water transport's only like single digits of our total transport. If we just brought that back in a meaningful way, the pressure on every other part of the transportation system would lessen, and the economic explosion we would see at any place you see blue on this map would have runaway growth, especially since we're in an environment where we need to double the size of the industrial plant. It would all go to the places that are blue. We can have stuff or not. That's the choice here. How we get there, that's the problem. Now, obviously, things like automation can help, but the labor crunch that we're seeing here is nothing compared to what the rest of the world is dealing with. You've got the boomers at the top. They're the ones who are retiring. On average, the boomers will have retired in the fourth quarter of this year. This is not a hazy future thing. This is the here and now. And they're being replaced by the Zoomers there at the bottom. They're the smallest generation we've ever had. So this calendar year, we're looking at a shortage of 400,000 workers. But all the Zoomers are already born. We know exactly what the inflow to the market is going to look like for the next 20 years. They're already here. We know that that 400,000 shortage is going to increase every year for at least the next 12. And then it'll probably peak at about 1 million shortage in 2034. So, if I could give you any advice, hire now. I don't care what it costs, because it's going to be more next year and the year after and the year after until we get to 2034. And then it'll start to fall back probably. Fuck. It's like, we always knew that the German economic model was going to end this decade, independent of the Ukraine war. We always knew that the Chinese had the fastest aging society in history before the data revisions. This is it. It's us, it's France, it's New Zealand. We're the only countries that have a semi-normal demographic structure. And I'm going to go out on a limb here. I'm going to guess that the French are going to keep it to themselves. And New Zealand is like 4 people. So it's, we either have the stuff when we build it ourselves, or we don't have the stuff because it's not coming from anywhere else. So we have a choice between high inflation and high growth that ends us with supply chains that are closer, simpler, employed by locals, more productive, greener, more reactive, and immune to international pressure, or high inflation and no stuff. Those are our choices. This is not a hard discussion.
So is Mexico, is that our source of material?
Yeah, well actually, yeah, go ahead and advance to the Mexican graphic if you would. There we go. Oh, thank God for Mexico. Now, you'll notice it's not perfect. When you get down to about the 30-year-olds, it goes straight down. Because Mexico is simply the most recent country to follow this pattern. So it used to be in the pre-globalized world that most people lived on farms. Russia is one of the world's top 3 suppliers of copper, of nickel, of cobalt, and of aluminum. And all of those are going to zero. So we're going to be in a position very soon where we have to decide which parts of the green transition are worth doing, because we will not have the materials to even attempt all of them. Greening the grid, just greening the grid and putting up a bunch of wind and solar, that's going to expand the size of the grid by at least half, probably double. EVs would be another doubling. And if you're looking at this on a carbon production transition period, putting up a wind tower, assuming you put it in a place where the wind blows, important detail, obviously has an immediate carbon impact. An EV does not, because an EV draws from the grid in its current form, and for the most part, the processing facilities required to build the EV in the first place are incredibly carbon intensive, and most vehicles running on most grids are going to take in excess of a decade to pay back the carbon debt. Data for heavier equipment, things like semis or forklifts or whatever, it doesn't exist yet because those products don't exist yet, but it's probably 2 to 3 decades. We need to break down through in materials science before we do it at scale for transport. Now, the United States and the Great Plains has the world's best wind zone, and the American Southwest from roughly central California down to central Texas is the second best solar zone. I'm not suggesting we can't do any of it, but I'm suggesting that in a constrained environment where we have to make choices because the inputs are limited, I'm just saying that EVs in their current form will not make the cut.
And you said obviously semis take so much more battery power.
Assuming they work,
Right.
which we don't know yet.
Right. Well, we hope to find out this year when
200,000, right, by the end of the year, right? Whew. We've got labor pressure at all points. Chinese manufacturers are going away. German manufacturers are going away. Russian materials are going away. The boomers may be retiring, but the millennials, their kids, are at the height of their consumption, suggesting a return to the inflation that we had in the 70s and 80s. And we need to double the size of the industrial plant at the same time. Every disinflationary trend of the last 75 years has flipped, and every inflationary trend is back all at the same time. We are looking at 9 to 15% inflation for at least the next 5 years. That's hardwired in, that's independent of anything the Fed does. That's just reacting to the strategic overall structural environment. Now, at the end of that 5-year period, if we have succeeded in building out the industrial plant, we go back to a much tamer system that will be lower for longer because the supply chains will be local, the materials processing will be local, and we'll be following our own labor metrics, which will have evolved because we'll have had to do a lot more with AI and a lot more with automation than we currently have, especially as we bring in things like electronics manufacturing. We won't have a choice. If we fail to do that, then the 9 to 15% inflation continues, and we have product shortages. It's, from my point of view, it's a really clear path. Because the alternative is just to go through the worst of it and get none of the benefits.